I wanted to just mention the reading that you had by Diane Hegeman. And in a way, it really is a pretty good lead-in to what we want to talk about today, which is to talk about gender. One of the things that Hegeman is doing is showing the way in which news photography works to capture certain images and not other images. I mean, in a way, that's quite foundational to a lot of the slides that I showed last time. That what they are trying to do is sort of get the essence of a narrative and get that across. And I gave examples starting with the Iwo Jima statue and photograph, the way in which the text, the headline, the moment, the form of the sculpture, the heroism of it all fits a kind of coherent narrative. And the people who are part of the process, and that's what I was trying to highlight, is that there are people who are part of that process. And they are accomplishing that narrative. And it isn't just one individual's job. The person who took the picture, for example, he turned in a whole series of images. And someone else also participated in choosing exactly which image. And then someone else chose how that would be then framed within a headline and the other items on that front page. And then someone else decided that this thing would be cast in bronze and put up as a monument and become a symbol of the Marines in physical form as a kind. And you can buy reproductions of it and have it in your own den or in your bedroom if you want. These are lots of people participating in different ways and in bringing off this piece of reality. Well, Diane Hegeman was for a good number of years a journalist, and then she became a photojournalist working for the Seattle Times, and then she became a professor of journalism with a specialty of photojournalism at the University of Missouri, which is one of our leading journalism schools. And at the University of Missouri, or because of her affiliation with the university, she became involved in many contests in judging the best pictures of the year in various categories. And what you see in your reading is the result of that kind of judging. She became aware of the fact that the judges were looking for a certain narrative. And so there were classic pictures that were the winners. So an athlete who is dejected after losing some sporting event, sitting on the bench with his face in his hands, the homeless person, the starving child. All of these are sort of classics of photojournalism, and to capture that moment is what the photojournalist is about. Those moments are highly conventionalized, and she became unhappy with those conventions, became unhappy with playing that role for her professional life, at least, of trying to capture those moments. Capturing those moments, and so she quit. And she quit journalism altogether. She quit photojournalism altogether. But before doing that, she published this book, and it's called How I Learned Not to Be a Photojournalist. And the way she learned not to be a photojournalist is to, in a way, see through this fabrication of stock images, of narratives that simplify the world and make it one thing as opposed to the other possibilities that it could be. And she started taking pictures that were much more ambiguous as to what they were, pictures in which things that were on the periphery could come to the center. Do you remember that picture last time of the Kent State killings and the contrast between the closely cropped picture of the woman bent over the dead body, almost like a Madonna, isn't it? It's almost like a Madonna with the dead Christ, holding the dead Christ in her arms. It's something like that. Talk about a classic narrative versus the actual picture that it came from. And you could see people just sort of standing around, interested, kind of on their way to class or wherever they were on their way to whatever to get a cheeseburger. And that was cropped out. She became interested in that, in those elements on the side, and using them as part of the narrative, making them much, much more complicated. But there's no market for that. Even really in our best newspapers, like the New York Times, the photojournalism is much more along the lines of this very simplified orientation to what's going on and cleaning up the side bits so that we can have that central idea coming through. Well, in this class, I mean, we have a heritage, in a way, of this class where we're talking a lot about this simplification of the world and the way it operates, and in a way, its necessity, because we can't be, there's only so much our brains can handle. We are very, very clever, there is no doubt about it. But when we interact and when we build our world together, we have to operate with certain simplifying assumptions, certain simplifying ideas. And that brings us to the class today, which is about gender. And next week we're going to talk about sexuality, or to some degree it's very hard to separate discussions of gender and sexuality, but we're going to do it to some degree, and to some degree not. Well, it's always back to the ducks and bunnies, who are our heroes of the semester, the duck and the bunny. And what I've just been talking about with photojournalism is really a case of the duck-bunny problem. How can something be both the duck and the bunny at the same time? That's just very complicated. And so we have a very strong tendency to drift into either duck or bunny. And as we remarked when I showed you that image, it's extremely hard, just cognitively, to see both duck and bunny all at the same instant. Well, now let's take that to what boys and girls, men and women, males and females. A fundamental distinction that is made in virtually every society I know about is the distinction between male and female. And I think it's quite common for many people in the world to see that as an unproblematic distinction. And indeed, to be based in biological clarity, that the plumbing is different between males and females. The biological underneath what we see in the plumbing with the chromosomes and all that is also different between men and women. And so there is something going on at a deep biological level that undergirds, reinforces, maybe stimulates in the first place this distinction between males and females. And so if I got volunteers in the class and I stood you up in the room and I asked the class to tell me, is this a male or a female? I would have, I think, 100% agreement. This would not be a duck-bunny problem. You would give me 100% agreement. And that then, that little test we could run would further reinforce and ratify the unproblematic and nature of this distinction, the simplicity of it. So in taking it on, we're taking on, in a way, a big challenge. To problematize male-femaleness is to take on something that is hard to problematize. If I said Democrats and Republicans, you know what the statistics are, probably, that you could all shout out Democrat and you'd be right the vast majority of times here at NYU. But you really wouldn't know for sure. It would be a much more problematic phenomenon, because we know that Democrats and Republicans don't come in biological form. But males and females do, don't they? Or do they? Or just what? So that's what we're going to take up. The framing for this, and again I go back to the dear duck and the dear bunny, is that these categories of some sort are critical to us as we go through life. When we do our symbolic interaction, work, which is so critical to our capacities to construct a society. It's the very essence of the way we construct ourselves and construct our collectivities. We have to have things going on in our brain, and they've got to be relatively simple. Things like boy, girl, man, woman, or, if, as the case may arise, a duck and bunny. And so we're not so eager to bargain away those possibilities of working with those simplicities. And that's right. I mean, we can't but go so far. So we can at least, though, study what it is we are doing as we do that, and then we'll worry later about whether we do it too much or we do it too little in regard to any particular thing. For example, do we do it too much on race, blacks and whites, Jews and Christians, things that are sort of middling between biologically determined and not so biologically determined, culturally and politically determined? Where do we draw the line and how do we play with it? And to what degree do we start taking sides and saying this distinction is wrong and we've got to get over it? Well, some people say, just to leap way ahead, that we have done much too much with the male-female distinction. We take it much too seriously, and that we really ought to try to move it to the side stage, and for many purposes, get rid of it altogether, and maybe indeed altogether, with one or two small exceptions like reproduction, where we seem to be stuck with it. Well, here we know that there are biological differences among us in this room, as well as all human collectivities. And we can see that as based in, sometimes people use the word sex to describe those differences that sort of come with the birth package, as opposed to gender, which is the sociological part. So we each have certain arsenals of plumbing and chromosomal structures, and that commonly among social scientists and other kinds of scientists is called sex. And those are sexual differences that people have from one another. Gender is another story. Gender consists of the ways in which society has different expectations of one or the other based on this sexual difference, and the way people perform those sexual differences. And so men used to be the case that men wore pants and women wore dresses. Those are obviously gender displays. Women, when they sip some tea, put their little finger up. And men don't put their finger up. Women ask questions, men make assertions. All of these are ways of doing gender. And there's one of your readings is indeed got that title. West and Zimmerman were the authors, Doing Gender. And this is a little bit of a more complicated reading than most of the readings this semester. So much of today's lecture is oriented toward that and trying to make that reading more easily available to you. Because what Zimmerman and West are saying is that this distinction between sex and gender, which is a real advance for people to start realizing that there is a distinction between the biological stuff and then the performance stuff and the exhibition stuff. That's a good beginning, but we have to go further. And the words, the title of their piece, Doing Gender, is starting to, right on its face, take us further. Because it's saying that gender is not something you just have through the way you were raised or through societal expectations, which are kind of in you and nailed in you, but is something that is constantly performed. Doing gender, it is an unending task. There is no time out. It is, and they use the term omnirelevant. Omnirelevant. And maybe if my juice is performing here, yes. Omnirelevant. It isn't omnirel. I don't do so well when I'm up here, do I, kids? It's omnirelevant. And they push that word and that idea because they want to battle the tendency, including by a person they greatly respect who falters to a slight degree once or twice, Irving Goffman. They want to get across the idea that this isn't something you just do on Saturday night when you go out. It's not just something that you worry about on a date. It's something that you are doing every minute of your being. It is relevant to all situations. All situations are gendered, and individuals are doing their gender with no time out, at all times and at all places. Each of us is a kind of case of doing gender, and we're organized all together to expect that gender to be done. So now we start getting to some interesting pieces of this puzzle. We all know that underneath our clothes, which are designed not to show it, there are these biological plumbing type differences. But in fact, as we make our lives, especially through Greenwich Village, looks can be deceiving because in fact there is not always that stuff there, and it might be there in different degrees. There are intersexed people, there are people who have had sex change operations, there are transgendered people, there are transvestites, there are all sorts of things going on that are in the gray zone. And yet, we impute when we see people that they are one or the other. And so, in effect, if we see a person who is doing, say, maleness, and there's nothing to contradict it in the way they look on the surface and how they are conducting themselves through their physical motions, the way they talk, we invent a penis. That is, we imagine it to be there. We complete the story and make this person clearly and wholly and unproblematically a male, as opposed to living with this possibility of duck bunniness. Now, I know here again in our little village, there are people who have in fact moved a little bit beyond that and are able to see duck bunniness when they look at human beings, other people, in terms of gender, because this is a very avant-garde neighborhood. But I must say it's not common, neighborhoods like that are not common, and I don't even think it's common in this neighborhood. I think as I move through Greenwich Village or any other place, I'm seeing males and females. And sometimes something sort of startles me, and I start grappling with something that's not right. Not right in the sense of it being one or the other. But that is very unusual, and I think in the vast majority of cases when it happens, I don't even notice it. I don't pay attention. I see a world of males, and I see a world of females. And this way of doing things, of seeing the world this way, is so important because it's the way we constitute our own identity, starting with a gender. It's the way we anticipate other people and figure out what they're about. And in that, and we also are participating in the common assumptions and activities of our own worlds, of our own culture, of the people that we are associated with each day, the ones we know and the ones we don't know. It's a way of doing applause. It's a way of enjoying and celebrating our linkages to other human beings. And it's the basis of shows and songs and dramas and all this other stuff. it is something that is not just a kind of peculiarity that each of us is stuck in. It's, in fact, part of our life together, and very hard to get out of it. And through some ways of looking, nor should we try. It is like Zimmerman and West would say, like all the other distinctions we make and classifications we do, and hence symbols we can use. What is a chair? What is a table? What is a car? What is a bike? All of those things are much fuzzier than we might imagine them to be. But by simplifying them, we can work them in our brain, and we can work them out. We can work them out together, and we can let things pass and move on to the next thought, the next identity, and enjoy what one another is bringing to the table. So it's a kind of conspiracy. We all know, now you know from this class, that that image of the duck and the bunny is both a duck and a bunny. But that isn't going to cause you to go out into the world and say, you know, really everything we're seeing could be something else. And stop everybody you see. You say to a friend or someone you pass in the street, how are you? They say, fine. You don't say, what do you mean fine? I heard you didn't do so well in your sociology midterm. Well, that's true. And what do you mean fine? I see you have a pimple on your nose. Well, yeah, I got the pimple on my nose. And your temperature, is it 98.7? What do you mean fine? We don't do that because fine is fine. We let it go. And that is crucial. So we all know, and I think people in this room know that sex has an indeterminacy to it, that there are people who are more or less, even in biological terms, more or less male and more or less female. But we let it go. And we let it go because if we had to question everything, then we couldn't do our thing together. The system, the structure of everything I've been talking about this semester would fall apart. So we constantly simplify it. Well, that then invites us to learn stuff about gender and sexuality in a different kind of way. It invites some more sort of opportunities for looking past this constant labeling of, say, male-female, to how that labeling is achieved and what it means that it's achieved in one way as opposed to another way. So you're reading this article by Thorne and Barry Thorne, who's a woman, by the way, and Luria, Zella Luria. By the way, all these people are interconnected with each other. Zimmerman and West know Thorne and Luria very well and vice versa, and you can see they quote each other, cite each other to some degree. These are pioneers in gender studies of the last 25 or 30 years in sociology. So Thorne and Luria say that children are recruited, they use that word, recruited into male and femaleness. And that recruitment starts right on the bat. And we know we have many examples. Boys wear blue, girls wear pink. They're put in blue, they're put in pink, and they're given different names. And you all know that from our little expedition into the name world. There are boys' names and there are girls' names. And although the substance of the names is different from culture to culture, there tend to be names for boys and names for girls, with some overlap, which operates in some interesting ways. But it's mostly they are different. These images are reinforced, of course, by the media, and much has been done, and that's why I won't bring it up, about how the media reinforce what a woman is and what a man is. It's much criticized for trivializing women and girls compared to boys and men. I'll give you some other examples which will be maybe less familiar to you. When the atom bomb was being developed by the United States, and they tested the first atom bomb in the American West over the desert, they had very, almost ridiculously simple intelligence and communication systems in those days. And they had to let the President of the United States, who was Harry Truman, know whether the bomb exploded or it didn't. This is the world's first nuclear bomb explosion. And the code was, does anybody know it? If it succeeded? Where's that voice? Yes. The fat lady sang, but there was another one. And the code was, that was very good, but that wasn't the first it. It was, it's a boy. If it worked and exploded, it's a boy. If it was a dud, it's a girl. And as we know, it was a boy. And a lot of consequence flowed from that. There are other things that we do, which are pointed out in your readings. So one of the things we do is, and I am very, by the way, very oriented toward this problem in some of my own work these days, we have toilet segregation outside the home. In the homes that you grew up in, and maybe some of the homes you now live in, if you have apartments and you share them with men as well as women, you know that at home, men and women use the same toilets, the same bathroom. And it really does work out, I can report. I've done that. And, but here in public, we do not do that, except in extremely avant-garde clubs, again, in places like downtown New York. But otherwise, there is just a vast preoccupation with separating men from women. And, well, you could say, well, that makes sense, because after all, women and men have this different plumbing. But what they've done is they've made this huge deal out of this different plumbing. So men can pee in toilets, just like women can pee in toilets, but they instead have the men pee in urinals. Well, that is more efficient. It uses less water, so a case could be made. That is not why it came about, by the way, but a case could be made. But still, you could have men and women in the same space, one peeing in urinals, and then shitting in toilets, and the women using the urinals for both functions, both elimination functions. But this is we're not very close to this. And instead, these announcements are made at every public facility. Choose, make your choice. What are you, male or female? Now again, for people who are somewhat on the border, this is a problem. Again, for women who are sick of waiting in lines that the men don't face, this is a problem. It starts having consequences. And now we start building the story of the way in which this distinction, which is, quote, natural both in the biological sense, in a way, and natural in the sense that we do need categories. By making them in this particular way, we start having consequences on people, and different kinds of consequences by who's in which category, even though there's both a man's and a woman's room. Women have to wait, which means, therefore, they're made uncomfortable, which means they may miss they may be too long at intermission. They may miss talking about the big deal in real estate with the guy who's going to make that deal at the urinal talking to another guy. And they are in line and are going to miss that conversation completely. So there are consequences to the way this is done, the way in which what is arguably a biological difference, and I say arguable because there are these variations even at the biological level, but arguably a biological difference, and then adding on our interpretations. Remember, we humans interpreting then what else that might mean. And here we have the case that it's okay to share the same bathroom at home, but it's not okay to do it here in a public place. And I've been part of the effort here at NYU to make some real pioneering moves as NYU moves into new spaces and remodels, to do away with the distinction between men and women's rooms, and with no avail, I must tell you. This is a hard one. Easier to make the French Revolution than to make this kind of change. Well, what else does this difference mean? You strip people naked, and 98 out of 100% of the time, you be right that you've classified them right, male and female. Well, what else does this mean besides having to have these separate bathrooms that take care of one versus the other? Well, one of the things that it means is the idea that women can do certain kind of work better than men can do. One of the things we notice about women is they have breasts. Men don't. They have vaginas. I don't have to spell out all of it for you, but those start implying reproduction. That is something that women can do and men can't do. So there is another sort of hard-ass distinction that isn't as hard-ass as it might appear, because some women, in fact, do not choose to reproduce. Some women cannot reproduce. But let's let that go and say that that's some kind of distinction worth playing with. Well, but then what does that mean? And one possibility is to saying, well, women, you see, are softer than men. Women have a givingness, a nurturing quality to them that men don't have. And by the way, both feminists and non-feminists have, in different branches of both spheres, have come up with something similar to that. Well, especially in the non-feminist sphere, this softness means that they're effective for raising children, but they're not effective for running the world. And so, there was right now we have the great fight about whether gays should be in the military. There was a great fight over whether women should be in the military, in the sense of being integrated in more normal troop movements rather than a kind of women's auxiliary of the military, which the waves were during World War II. That they should be right there. And even now, the issue persists whether they can fly planes, whether they should be in battle, and all the rest of those things. So can and should women, because of these biological differences that we see are there, more or less, should they be prohibited from being in the military? Should they be not running corporations? Should they not be professors, except maybe in art history? Should they not be running universities? Did I say that? All of these responsible roles, because they will not do that adequately. It's a man's job to do those things adequately. And but it's a woman's job to basically be at the home. And the term that was used throughout to characterize this doctrine throughout the 19th century and earlier in the 20th century is the ideology of separate spheres. So it's a kind of doctrine like separate may be equal. And the equality comes, of course, by a woman using her nurturing qualities and her softness to mate up with a man, and that, and then through the man, she will have the appropriate income of her social class, educational level, or whatever. But there have to be these separate spheres. So we come to, again, a set of consequences, like women making less money than men, even when they're in the same job slot. But what we find more massively is separate jobs for men and women. Now, how that exists is different in different societies. So, for example, in the Soviet Union, when there was a Soviet Union, doctors were overwhelmingly women. At the same moment in history when physicians were overwhelmingly male in the United States. So right then and there, we saw in two relatively modern societies that you could take those biological differences and interpret them differently. So medicine and doctoring involves care and concern for others. I'm now working with the stereotype, which is, I think, not exactly appropriate. And so, sure, we should have women doctors, as opposed to the idea that, wait a minute, doctoring involves making critical decisions on people's lives. It involves the integration of scientific knowledge with practice. That is not for a girl. That is a man's job. And so therefore, in the interpretation of the United States, as life was practiced here, it's a man's job. So we start getting some clues to how this thing is working. Same biology and distinctions in the Soviet Union as in the United States, but a very different interpretation is made. One of the next aspects is pay. How much do people make? In the Soviet Union, being a doctor was a relatively low-paid occupation, whereas being a doctor in the United States is a high-paid occupation. And now we start getting ourselves to another clue to the story. And that is, it's not that this work is unimportant and that's why women do it and are appropriate to do it, and receive less wages. Rather, it is because women do it that it does get less wages. So in the United States, the doctors are men, and therefore the wages are high. What is being paid high wages for is not the doctoring, but the manning. It's the gender that's being paid off at a high level, not the actual tasks that are being accomplished. And in the Soviet Union, because it's a woman's occupation, it is paid less. So now we start getting to some more consequences, which is that women's lower pay in the United States in general, which is true, on the whole, women make less money at work than men do. In part, it's due to the fact that within a given occupation, women are getting paid less than men. Women doctors paid less than male doctors, women professors less than male professors, and things like that. That is decreasing, by the way, in degree, and all you women have a very fine futures ahead in terms of your access to professional training and the incomes that you can achieve if you go in that direction. That's what's ahead for you. But the main difference is the work that people do. So women become childcare teachers overwhelmingly compared to men. Men become doctors, women become nurses. As long as we have this occupational segregation, then it's going to turn out that there is this difference in capacity to earn and have a good living. How do you address that? Well, one way you can address that is by encouraging women to stop becoming childcare teachers and instead to become plumbers or aviation pilots or like that, and get them out of their rut and get them to become doctors in greater number. The other perspective is to change our understanding of what what an occupation should be paid, how much it should be paid, how much the people who do it should be paid. So I think I've used this example, or maybe I have. How is it that being a child care teacher should be paid less than being a plumber? One could argue that what's at stake in child rearing and in child care is the most precious thing there is. You have upper class people here in Manhattan who are giving their most precious thing, the thing that they spend vast amounts of money on, and they will as this little thing grows up and has to go to NYU and they have to pay NYU tuition. But when the little thing is helpless and defenseless and completely at the mercy of the adults around them, the person who is paid to take care of this little thing is paid bottom wages. And we just let it go at that. they're paid less. In other words, how can it be, again, the function of what's going on? How can the wages be a function of the importance of what's going on, as opposed to somehow structuring the circumstance where, because it is done by women, it is undervalued compared to being done by men. And so the slogan has become comparable worth. The idea that what women do should be seen as having comparable worth to what men do. That women's occupations are worth as much as men's occupations. And if we did that, we would do a revolution in women's earnings capacity, much more so than these much more slower projects of trying to get women to be more interested in, say, going to business school and flying airplanes, that would be better. Some other examples of how we organize this thing and set it up as to who's going to be doing what and what counts and what doesn't. Sports. In general, men and women are segregated in sporting events, and some sports are paid much more than other sports. We all know this, and that women's sports is much less of a big deal than men's sports. Both in football, for example, baseball, are overwhelmingly men's sports, and the people who do those sports, basketball, are paid far more than people who do, say, volleyball, figure skating, gymnastics. But that's because, this riff would go, that's because we value it more. It's like plumbing more than valuing childcare. But that shouldn't be just taken for granted based on the biology of the people who do it, but instead see that as something that's institutional, that we have constructed. So, as one of my former students has pointed out in her work, women's bodies are more flexible. Women have greater endurance. Women have higher fat content in their bodies. Now, higher fat content is like, wow, that is a terrible thing to say about another person. But women do have higher fat content, and then you can make of that, and you can make jokes about them being fat. And you can say, well, they could never play basketball because they've got all that fat content. Well, that makes them able to swim the English Channel, thank you very much, in ways that men cannot do. Their bodies are more flexible. So that's why in figure skating and in gymnastics, women are fabulous. So the question is, why aren't those sports the more valued sports? Why aren't those audiences the largest audiences? Why aren't the people who do that well paid the most money? It's because, is it because, I can't prove anything here, is it because, precisely because, it is what women have a, quote, natural ability to do more than men. Here's another small anecdote of how this works, of how we recreate this process again and again and again. And that is, if we run another experiment, if we have people in this classroom who are boyfriend and girlfriend, as I look across the room, I can't see any strong evidence of spooning or exhibitions of that, which I sometimes do, but I haven't noticed it this semester. If I bring you up to the front of the classroom, you know what I would find? I would find that there would be, almost in every case, the young man would be taller than the young woman. That's what I would find. And certainly in stocking feet, that's what I would find. So we do know that on the whole, men are taller than women. That's the biological fact of the distribution. But we also know there is a large overlap between the height of men and the height of women. And that becomes a serious, an even larger scale phenomenon when we have people of varied ethnicity, which we have here, of course, at NYU, in which some ethnic groups tend to be shorter than the other ethnic groups. Yet the dating I'm happy to say, at a place like NYU, often involves mixed, across the races, dating and making out and all the rest of it. So it means that the fact that we'll find a taller male with a shorter female almost across the board means that much more than is determined biologically, we are making the biological difference into, we're hardening it, we're elevating it, we're making it unexceptional. We are displaying its universal prevalence by how it is we are coupling up. And we do know that in some cases, Danny DeVito, I'll betcha, has a taller woman as his partner. And so when you have enough rich and power and all of that, you start doing it. But it's been my observation that even in avant-garde settings, like, say, the NYU Sociology department, that whether it comes to married couples among the faculty or the coupling up of our very avant-garde graduate students, we will see the taller man and the shorter woman. So it's just an example. Again, I'm not calling anybody names. I'm just saying that it's something we all do. And we participate in creating this structure of taking this biological, statistical phenomenon of, on the whole, men being taller than women, and turning it into an advertisement of it being universally true when it's not. And we're all like applauding. We're applauding that phenomenon. We're making it true. We're doing something not only with biology, but also with gender in order to bring one vision of reality into being as compared to another. Now, of course, last time, or I think it was last time, or sometime before, we spent a lot of time talking about conversation, and you are reading, or you read Pamela Fishman, and the way in which women are dealt with in conversation. And again, Zimmerman and West, the video, we saw the video, didn't we? Of conversation between Zimmerman and West. And the interruption pattern. And of course, West would see that as doing gender, that the male and the female, including even talking with Zimmerman, that together they are making something of this biological difference, which has, in this case, a detrimental effect on women. The less opportunity that they then therefore have to participate. Let me give you another example from another of my former students who studied people who work on oil drilling platforms offshore. Can you imagine that? And the whole deal was whether women could or should work on the platforms. One of the titles she had but got rejected was Gender on the Shelf, it being the Outer Continental Shelf. And how was gender operating out there? And one of the very concrete things was that the bags of cement, which they worked with a whole lot in their jobs out there, came in 25-pound bags and 50-pound bags. And they kept ordering the 50-pound bags. Now, women are not only on the whole shorter than men, but they're also on the whole weaker than men. Now, we know there's a huge overlap there, and many women are stronger than many men. But to the degree to which you can set up the work so that the work is physically demanding, you will benefit men. And men enjoyed the macho quality of getting a 50-pound bag and showing they could do it, whereas the women had a much more difficult time doing that. And so the women either had to do it in teams or they couldn't do it at all. So when they would order the cement in the 50-pound bags, you make it more difficult for women to do the job that they could have done easily with the 25-pound bags. And this capacity to structure the workplace is constantly going on. One of the places where, to get back to the men's and women's rooms, is the problem of women's having a place to go to the bathroom at work. The U.S. Senate had no place for women senators to go because there was assumed to be no such thing as a woman senator. And so women had to go to the tourist bathroom, which was way down the hall and around the corner and all the rest of it, because there was not imagined that anyone who didn't have a penis could also be a senator. And that then made that very problematic. And it makes it harder for someone to be a senator when there is no place to go. And in all the occupations, I shouldn't say all the, in many occupations, when they do become integrated, like for example in the New York subway system, driving the subway car, and all of that stuff, there are facilities along that trail of the subways for people to take their break. But there didn't used to be women's rooms. So now what women do? Well, they would have to go out of the subway onto the street and find a place at a grocery store or a restaurant as a place to go. This is a very disheartening and discouraging mode of serving people's needs. And so it inhibits women's ability to take the job. So I point out to you two things that probably all just ran past you. The problem that women have in an example like that is first that there is no women's room. But secondly, that there is a women's room at all. That if the gender segregation wasn't nailed in place, then they wouldn't have the problem. They could just go where the men go. But there, in this setting, that is not possible. And so it is that we can't do it. Here's another example. In the Middle East, in the United Arab Republic, in Dubai, there is a men's room and a man's university and a women's university. The women's university, at the men's university, the men and women can go at leisure in and out of the university, in and out of buildings, no problem. The women's university is surrounded by a high wall with barbed wire. And there is no communication possible between the men's university and the women's university. Now, here at NYU, look at us. We see that as just utter ridiculous. We can't imagine these primitive people doing that. It's just that they have made a distinction based on that plumbing that we think is crazy. But we do it when we get to the plumbing, and would very much take notice if that distinction didn't exist here in terms of the men's room and the women's room. So again, what I'm getting back to again and again is not to contest the plumbing so much, although I contest it a little bit because we have mixed cases, but to contest, and not even to contest the gender so much. Yes, we have men's displays, and we have women displaying womenness, men displaying womenness, but to talk about what is done with those differences. And what is done with those differences is very much an open question and is completely linked into the social structure of the society and has consequences just across the board. So I mentioned that one of the things that women can do under a doctrine of separate but almost equal or sort of equal is to achieve their equality through men. And this idea of living through men, and in particular living through a man, becomes an important aspect of life, of success, especially before women could get into the professions, but even still to some degree, I think, the road ahead for a woman is to hook up with a man. And the language used to be quite explicit. The wedding vow was to love, honor, and obey is what the woman pledged. And I think in some marriage vows, the formal ones, that is still the case. Isn't it? Is anybody married here? It's not what they say? Where did that voice come from? I can't find you. Hi. What is the vow now? Obey wasn't there. Well, it used to be love, honor, and obey. And what? Respect is what's now said? You think so? Okay. Well, people, of course, now write their own vows, and the state of New York doesn't care actually what you say. It doesn't matter at all as a legal issue. But the tradition was love, honor, and obey for the woman, and no obey for the man. And that signals a difference, which is that women are going to gain their status through the man. I'm not that old, but I can tell you that when I was younger, women could not get a credit card in their name. They had to be a Mrs. and then the man's name before they could get credit, get a mortgage. So you enter a world which, in terms of gender, has been very dramatically changed. Okay. So what am I getting at? And this is now by way of summary. I started as maybe it's my religious doctrine now to begin with homage to the duck and the bunny and worship them. And to say that the way we choose duck or bunny is, when it comes to gender, is to, and sexuality, is to constantly work up and reinforce this distinction. And no timeout, omnirelevant, and make it on constant display. And the other point that I tried to make today is that this is all very consequential. It means that, at least historically and today in many cultures around the world, the only route to a decent life is through a man, and that obviously puts women under the dominance and control of men. To the degree to which it is still true in our own culture, and I think it is, it means the same, that women are in that situation. And I've been dealing so far, I've been using all my examples, that of romantic couples or husband and wife, but it corresponds to more than that. It corresponds, for example, to mothers. There's a famous book called Portnoy's Mother's Complaint, called Portnoy's Complaint, I just gave it away, in which Philip Roth is writing about the constant intervention of the Jewish mother in his life. And the Jewish mother and the Jewish son is a constant theme in much of literature and comedy. And you can substitute Italians and Irish mothers, and you can just go on and on with that. Why is it that women are doing that? And the answer is they are living through their sons. And so a friend of mine wrote a piece, which I slipped into a minute ago, called Portnoy's Mother's Complaint, which is that I've not had the opportunity for a life. I've not had an opportunity to be recognized. And so, of course, I live through my son. What else have I got? What else have I got? Or in another song that I've enjoyed very much over the years, and never made the hit parade at all, but it was a great question, and that was, did Jesus have a sister? Doesn't anybody know? I always enjoyed that one as well. So with that, go forth, go out and do your gender. Don't get in any trouble, and I'll see you next time.